Dr. James Robertson is Assistant Professor of Christian History at Tyndale University. He's the author of Overlooked, the Forgotten Origin Stories of Canadian Christianity. Dr. Robertson teaches the development of Christianity around the world with a focus on the development of the faith during the Reformation and into the modern age. His focus on church and war has brought him into dialogue with the military, interfaith groups, and various peace organizations. I know I myself absolutely love history, and especially history of the church, so I'm really looking forward to this and looking forward to hearing what we hear from Dr. James Robertson. Welcome.
And before I just give it over to him, if you're wondering why is Wendy sitting up here? Jamie's a friend of mine. We've connected. We're doing a two-part here today. So if there's questions and answers, Q&A time, I'm here to facilitate that. And I'm just here to tell you, even if you don't like history, he's going to make you love it, because he's like a historical psychologist, I call him, because it makes sense today. So over to Jamie.
Okay. Well, come on, Wendy. That's a lot of pressure.
No pressure.
I'm very excited to hear what I'm about to say.
See, I told you he's funny too.
Well, let me begin by saying, first off, sorry that I couldn't be there. I want to be good and Canadian and just start off with an apology. I'm sorry that I could not be there in person. It's always a bit of a, like I said, it's lovely we can do this, but it's not quite the same thing as being in the room there. So I'm hoping to engage in conversations. Feel free, like Wendy's going to be sort of there. So thank you, Wendy, for doing this. But I love running this because we have some time together. If there's sort of questions that come up during, I'm not opposed to sort of stopping and having a conversation to get some of the big ideas here. But for me, it's sort of like the things I've noticed throughout history in the years and years and years I've been studying it is there's a few sort of major themes that come up, and probably one of the most prevalent ones that I see that I'd like to bring to all my students, whether I'm teaching the history of Christianity from like the Council of Jerusalem up to about the medieval period, or the history too, which starts right around the 1400s, and that whole pesky Protestant Reformation and all those crazy Anabaptists and all that sort of stuff up to the modern age, is one of the major elements we see is that people's understanding of the Jesus event, as I like to call it, of how that impacts all sorts of decisions in life, are largely influenced, of course, by both your place and your time. And some people get concerned about that. So I just want to say that right off the bat, that this is not something that we need to be concerned about as Christians in the 21st century. In fact, it opens our eyes to a lot of very necessary information. And for me, theologically, it's very incarnational. It's very pneumatological. This is the point of Pentecost, is that Christ's Spirit dwells within each one of us. And we, of course, dwell in the world, even if we're not of the world, on our really good days. We are in the world, but not of our world. But let's be honest, sometimes we're a little bit more of the world than we'd like to believe. But I'm always fascinated by the fact, and I'll start the talk in a moment here about this, is, of course, we have our spirit, and then we have the Bible. And the Bible is the sort of the first thing we'll look at. It's one thing that Christians of all varieties hold as preeminent for our information about Jesus and, of course, our lives. And yet, that has proven, this is not a condemnation of the Bible, but it has proven not equal to the task of unity, that Christians are very divided, sometimes violently so, hence all my studies in church and war. And famous American historian Mark Noll wrote a great book about this on the Civil War. And he wrote the book called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, because we have two camps, both with the same background, same language, same culture, same time, same place, same Bible, and in some cases, even the same passages, yet coming to such antagonistic understandings and interpretations that it literally created war. And the American Civil War is not the only example of that. So I think it's really interesting for us to dig in and really acknowledge the fact that we all come at Scripture from a specific worldview, and we can and to not judge or condemn ourselves at, but to open our eyes and with the glasses and sort of look at like, oh, okay, so that's how I'm seeing it, because I think God in His infinite mercy meets us where we are and moves us into other places as well. But that's sort of the backdrop of this is looking at how we look at the Bible, how we can be open to the fact that we don't just read the Bible, but the Bible reads us. And so place and time are so essential, because where you believe impacts what you believe, but also when you believe. And as a historian, when you believe impacts what you believe is one of my mantras, my go-to, that I try to explain to my students. So with that in mind, I am My official title is Dr. James Robertson, but by all means, call me Jamie, as Wendy already did. She let the cat out of the bag. Thanks, Wendy. Let's be casual and have some fun with this. I was born on Vancouver Island in the very British city of Victoria. My father drove a double-decker bus, so some of my earliest memories are sitting on those wonderful double-decker buses. And of course, British influence reigns very, very large over Canadian culture, as does our neighbors to the south. But we'll kind of come into that. That's part of this as well, as we look at this strange and distant land is the topic that I'm talking about here. How we sort of look at the strangeness and the distance within Canada. Because finding a Canadian identity, irrespective of Christian denominationalism gives us a whole other series of conflicting understandings. But even if we're just sort of take that across, and finding a Canadian sort of milieu is tricky, even for Canadians. Not that anybody else than Canadians really gives us much thought, and that's one of the points behind my book Overlooked, is that we tend to be overlooked globally, even as we tend to overlook some items that are wonderful in our own country. But figuring out what is a Canadian, I mean, about the closest thing, because I mean, of course, there's the old stereotypes of loving hockey, but lots of us don't like hockey. There's the beer drinkers. A lot of us don't or will not drink beer. I know lots of Canadians who are not polite. Some might say I'm the same way. And I mean, I think we all kind of like maple syrup, but that's it. So the stereotypes don't necessarily hold up. About the only thing I've been able to find is that everybody in Canada pretty much agrees that Toronto is the worst. So that's the closest I've been able to find to across, I grew up in the prairies. I grew up in Calgary, so I was born in Vancouver Island. By the age of 7, I grew up in Calgary, so I grew up in the shadow of the foothills, but I haven't had more than my share of prairie winters. And that leads me to the second slide, Wendy, if you can switch to the second one there. There we go. What is up with the prairies? What is going on? Because even though I've lived in Ontario for almost 2 decades now, moving here, and one of the guys I work with the closest, he's from the East Coast, he's from New Brunswick, and they used to call it worst case Ontario, and then I grew up calling it Ontario. I'm sure you have your own things, but yet here we are. I think it's really, really fascinating, and some of the stuff I've been doing with Canadian history is sort of looking at the ways in which different regionalisms really do impact some stuff and have driven the nation forward, even as they've been antagonistic. And perhaps it's my own affinity with where I was raised, but the prairies are getting increasingly fascinating to me. And Wendy knows this, and this is another risk of offense, and I don't mean it to offend. I just want to be candid and honest. I personally am not the biggest fan of the prairies. I'm much more of a mountain and ocean kind of person. The prairies are not my favorite geography. I'm aware of the fact that could put me in the bad books, so just cut me some slack. This is just out of a desire to be honest. But yeah, so there is really something interesting. And last time I was just in Winnipeg, unfortunately, last week, which is why I couldn't make it there this week. But there's some really fascinating elements about prairie understandings, prairie culture, prairie wildlife, which includes all of you. And then we add all the denominational differences into it as well. And we get some really interesting nuance that I think is exciting and well worth exploring. So the reason why I bring this all up is, Wendy, if you go to the next slide. Thank you. Just want to make sure I'm getting this. I also want to know, what is your experience? And this is where the conversational element of us talking comes into it. So what we're going to be looking at in this next little while, and again, feel free to interrupt me if an idea is like, hang on a sec, or can you just sort of speak more into that? I'm happy to do that. All those different elements, because really at the end of it, the conversation, and at the back of it, ask any sort of specific question you want. I'm happy to do that. We do have some time, and I've yet to meet anybody who minds when a session ends early, so I think we'll be fine there. So we got some time to move. But I'm going to be looking at some of the sort of the larger national trends that were happening in the latter part of the 20th century. But in the back of your mind, judge what I'm talking about based on your own experience, your own denominational experience, your own personal experience within that denomination, whether you grew up there, you come to it a little bit later in life, some of the tensions you see within it, some of the questions you have about both the past, the present, and then I suppose the future. But I hope you see some of your own experience in what it is that I'm talking about. Be like, oh, that actually offers a little bit of insight. What about this? I think those conversations are my favorite. At the end of the day, I'm very much a researcher. So I'm always happy to engage, because everyone in that room will bring some new perspectives and new understandings that probably I haven't considered, and that always makes the conversation a little bit richer. So there's my preamble, and I know you're like, oh my goodness, that was the preamble. That's as long as each section will be, so we'll go there. I'll pause now to see if anybody does have any comments. Usually it's a bit early for that, and it's right after lunch, so I'm expecting most of your time is digesting, and I'm happy to go on, but I'll give a little pause right now before I begin. All right, let's go to the first slide then, if everybody's okay. All right, I think, like I already said, we should probably start with the Bible. Just so you understand the slides there, Vast and Strange Canada, strange and distant, that's on me. We want to look at, but if you look at the bottom there in the yellow, I hope that works well. If anybody there has like any color blindness or anything along those lines, I hope you can see there. But if you can't, I'm just going to sort of look at, this is about the 1910 to 1945, but the topic, the sort of theme of the Bible is what's happening. And I think this one's really, really important, especially as we look at this term of like safety and security, which at the end of the day is something we're all craving. We all want. We want it for ourselves. We want it for our loved ones. And when I look at the news cycles in our present day, they are absolutely vehicles of fear, insecurity, threats. You can't listen to the news for more than 10 seconds without finding out that your life, what you value, is in jeopardy. From a Christian perspective, it seems to be that Christianity is very much being threatened in Canada. And we can definitely have these sort of discussions. I'll make the argument as we get into it, like after about the 1990s into the early 2000s, Christianity doesn't loom as large in the national rhetoric. And that is not, a result of us being bad Christians or a vast conspiracy against Christianity, as much as it was some very measured and intentional policies designed to advance Canada in a different direction, which, like I said, we'll come to in a few moments. But the idea of fear and security, especially for Christians, at the end of the day, as I was already noted, was we are informed by the Bible. In 1910, and actually for several decades before that, even the interpretation of the Bible was held up for challenge. It started in Germany, but quickly spread throughout Europe, and then into America, and of course Canada as well, both through European and American challenges. It was known as higher criticism, biblical criticism. And in essence, and this lacks nuance, was this notion that the Bible, like other ancient documents, was open to be sort of critiqued, not to take it down, but like, how did we actually get this book? So it didn't descend like in the light from heaven as a King James version. There was multiple steps, numerous anonymous authors. And so the Bible was sort of critiqued on a bunch of different levels to better understand the worldview, the people that wrote it, how we got it, what the different challenges were, and lo and behold, it yielded a pretty profound amount of material that was with us to this present day. And if anybody's done any sort of graduate level work on the Bible, you are wrestling with some version that started in the late 19th century and into the 20th century. In about 1910 to 1912, a series of books, about 12, were published, known as the Fundamentals. And this was composed by numerous scholars, ministers, leaders from the UK, from Europe, from America, even a few from Canada, that basically argued what the fundamentals you needed to believe were in order to call yourself a Christian. These were designed to be trans-denominational. I don't think you'll be surprised to find out the idea of like the divinity of Christ, the reality of the Trinity, salvation through Christ. All these things were put in there as being like the fundamental, the base level in order to call yourself a Christian. And while this was sort of in response to those who were increasingly concerned about ideas somewhat challenging the historic interpretations of the faith, it did create some divisions within Protestantism first, which was always very divided, but later on in the 20th century within Catholics as well, and in Canada, that had profound ramifications, so much so that I would make the argument that the Canadian story of secularization is the story of secularization in the modern world that all nations should actually be able to pay attention to. With that little spoiler, I'll leave that for something we're going to come to later. But there was a lot of advancements in the early 20th century that gave almost a utopic view. I mean, that's not, of course, across the board, but there was definitely a sort of a sense that humanity was getting better. We were coming up with a lot of medicines, a lot of inventions. Things were getting better. Quality of life was getting better. Longevity of life was getting better. And within that sort of crept a growing theology that humans would actually, in the grace of Christ, but through these advancements, we're kind of coming into a more enlightened age. Of course, this is inspired by the Enlightenment several centuries earlier. More enlightened space, and it's less about human total depravity, and it's more about human foibles and sin, but sin with almost like a lowercase s. But given time and space, humans are actually coming to a place where it's less about Jesus needing to save us and a little bit more about us as a species getting to a place where we'd almost earned Jesus coming back, or we would sort of elevate ourselves to that. Now, that did not last long, because we also know within the first half of the 20th century, we have the Great Depression, the economic collapse in the West that would spread around the globe. We have two global conflicts that showed humanity's ability for death and carnage to be unfathomable. The amount of numbers that came out of the First World War, which at first was somewhat argued to be, the Great War, the war to end all wars. It was sort of that last human kick at the can, so it's going to be big, and then that'd be the death of war, which of course has tragically proven not to be the case. And then by the end of the Second World War, the whole idea that humanity was somehow getting better was pretty much an untenable position. And that sort of brought back a really interesting dynamic. The idea of human depravity became very much, if I can say this delicately, it actually became a little bit en vogue. And what we'd had in the early part of the 20th centuries is those who held to the fundamentals, this sort of which quickly and frankly, due to the media, became almost like a rejection of any modern thinking, a rejection of science, anti-intellectualism, largely thanks to the Scopes monkey trial that took place in America in the 1925, 1926. It kind of painted those who were adherents to the fundamentals of the Christianity as anti-intellectual, as mental children that were just sort of holding on to ancient superstitions. Whereas those who are willing to be a little bit more conversant with the ideas like Darwinian evolution, higher criticism, the fact that the Bible might actually be more of a collection of myths, didn't necessarily have to historically happen. Well, they were considered the more relevant, intelligent faith, largely, especially in the West, of the middle classes. So tensions were forming within Protestantism. That would happen in Catholicism, but like more in the 1950s, 1960s, and it would split along the same line, with the youth and the young being a little bit more philosophical, a little bit more political, and the older ones being seen as those who were sort of holding into the old, steadfast traditions of Catholicism. So in the 20th century, and again, I want to stress this, it was largely a trope of the media. And unfortunately, historians like myself have sort of played into that trope as we look back, when there was actually a tremendous amount of nuance. So we can get into that if there's discussions, but just for the sake of simplicity, a lot of those fundamentals, and especially if they were people who were vocal about their support of the fundamentals, they of course became known as the fundamentalists. So that very much sort of brought these fundamentalists, became increasingly mocked and unable to converse on the larger sort of rhetoric, especially when the fact that there's Protestants who are more open to these discussions, able to speak, and they found other ways to sort of bring these challenges in, but maintain that Christianity was relevant. And largely what they did was focused on the ethical teachings of Jesus, or the importance of understanding the literary, if not literal, interpretations of the gospel. So for an example, in Matthew and Luke, when we have Jesus feeding either the 4,000 or the 5,000, what some like an example of an argument would be is that was not an actual event. Rather, it was sort of a mythical account of what all of us could be doing. If we all contributed our little amounts, we could actually produce larger amounts that would benefit people that who otherwise wouldn't have access to food, medicine, whatnot. All right, so I just want to wrap up this section on this whole idea of safety and security. This really does strike at the heart of very modern Christian faith in this early part of the 20th century. Is that, like I said, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, just as one example, but this will be in the Catholic Church. This will be throughout Christendom. Without maybe there's a certain sense that a lot of evangelical denominations, this became almost like a shibboleth to them. Like this is where we stand on the inerrant Word of God. arguments that, I mean, Christians for 1,900 years had believed, but because of these sort of developments now felt the need to very much articulate this and articulate to some minutia various ideas of what the scripture meant, like how we understand the scripture, how we got the scripture. And that did make it very divisive. So we do have a lot of Protestants arguing, being increasingly more comfortable arguing against each other. I mean, traditionally, most Protestants, even if they didn't get along super well, the big bad guy on the block was the Roman Catholic Church, obviously. Orthodox, the variety of different Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox churches never really were large enough to constitute somewhat of a fragmented religious ethos, which is what Canada has really been since the late 1700s. But again, with these early 20th century developments, these ideas made some Protestant denominations very antagonistic to one another. But on the other side of World War II, the more conservative, for lack of a better term, Protestant groups were able to have almost like a resurrection. One, because they were really good with the radio, and media is another thing we're going to look at. But two, again, because of all the scandals and all the big global problems that had happened, I mean, 2 world wars, a global pandemic, a financial crisis, sounds familiar, had really sort of taken any idea that humanity was on an upward trajectory, and it really made total depravity and the real fallen nature of humanity much more tenable, and actually a pretty extra religious worldview that a lot of people could be sympathetic to. Look what man's inhumanity towards man kind of an idea. But on the other side of World War II is where things get really, really interesting. And this will go to the next one, Wendy, if you don't mind, is we have the boom, because like any massive global conflict, it is very lucrative for a small percentage of people for a time. But as soon as a war ends, there's always a financial depression, sometimes a full-on collapse, even if your infrastructure wasn't destroyed like it was so much in Western Europe. Of course, after the Second World War, we do see America go into its ascendancy to become America, as we think about it today, because their infrastructure was not destroyed, with the exception, obviously, of Pearl Harbor. America, for large parts, had none of the damage wrought upon it like the UK and Western Europe and the other powers up until that point had been. They were in a phase of rebuilding. But North America was also going into a phase of rebuilding as well. And this is something where the churches actually will hit their zenith in Canada. In the 1950s and 1960s, we have never had attendance rates in the history of Canada like we do in that immediately post-World War II period. And a lot of that is geared around family union, the marriage and the family unit, what we like to refer to now as the baby boom. These are children born from about 1946 to about 1964. They're short form known as the boomers. I'm assuming we have some boomers in this room. Boomers are the only ones who are really interested in history. So I'm going to assume, hello. Unfortunately, on technology in recent years, the boomers have also been the convenient generational boogeyman and bad guy blamed for all the evils of the world. And then my generation, Generation X, is basically just overlooked. But I'll get to why that's a mistake in a moment. But this one of the reasons behind this boom for the churches, especially in this very divided, very scary time, was in order to stimulate the Canadian economy, and this it's different in the States, but I'm just going to focus on Canada now. In order to stimulate the Canadian economy, a lot of war homes were built. A lot more immigration was pushed again towards the prairies. Now that we're sort of through those dirty 30s, the prairies are starting to get a lot more of the desired immigrants, especially those who are good farming. And so what was considered a desirable immigrant started to change in the 1940s and 1950s. Up until that point, Mennonites were sort of how do I put this delicately, the top of the bottom as far as desired immigrants, because Mennonites were very, very known to be very good with farming and whatnot, and so we're considered sort of valuable for that. But of course, in the 1930s, we also have, and this kind of goes back to our prairie thing, we also have a lot of people pulling out of the big city schools in places like Toronto, Montreal, over again those concerns around the Bible. And so what we have in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s is an absolute metaphorical explosion of confessional Bible colleges. And the Mennonites led the charge. And I believe 44% of the Bible colleges planted from the late 20s to the early 40s were Mennonite of some stripe and some variety. And I mean, this is something we get into, and this is again going back to what's your experience as well. Is of course there's lots of divisions happening within Mennonite communities, but from the larger sort of bird's eye view from both Canadian religion and Canadian government, a Mennonite is a Mennonite is a Mennonite. Especially if you're in the prairies, just go and do your work. But there's a lot more theological and ecclesiastical divisions that are happening. And again, that's really interesting because all these confessional Bible colleges as well, there's a lot of interesting, I'm going to say infighting. I think that's a bit too much, but there's a lot of tensions and dynamics and splits that are happening that don't necessarily receive the attention of sort of people like myself, like larger, definitely denominational historians and theologians. But again, the divisions didn't impact larger and really in the 20th century, I would say Eastern, and by which I mean like Ontario and Quebec, it didn't necessarily impact the economy and the struggles like, for example, when the Presbyterians or the United Church formed, these had larger ramifications nationwide. The prairies are sort of looked at again as the breadbasket, and as long as grain and wheat and supplies and land's getting tilled, there is a sort of sense of like, just, okay, we don't care about all those other deals, just as long as this sort of stuff happens. And again, that's one of those sort of fun elements of the prairies is they're so vast and large that, if I can say this irresponsibly, you can kind of get away with a lot more than you can when you're sort of closer to the quote unquote centers of power or the cities or whatnot. So there's a real interesting almost, from the Eastern perspective, there's almost a perpetual rebellious spirit in the prairies. And like just, oh my goodness, like not quite towing the Canadian line. And actually kind of funny enough, I was talking with Wendy about this last week, Winnipeg is kind of the, I would actually I'm starting to see a lot, I'm like, I think Winnipeg might actually be on the vanguard of that sort of like Western prairie rebellious spirit. And so that's kind of fascinating. This is a bit of an aside, but you're going to see this theme throughout it. But in this 1950s, early 1960s, basically a lot of government money went into the creation of war homes, which are small, fairly contained, very affordable homes. They told soldiers and young women to get married, to have sex and have babies. And the soldiers were like, you had me at sex. And that was basically about it. It was a very popular social movement. And they created a very interesting geographical, back to the land space that was not quite city, not quite country. And of course, I'm referring to the suburbs, hamlets outside the inner city, where for most cities was still where most of the industry happened. So dad, and this was sort of how it was pitched for many years there, dad goes to work in the city, drives to the train station, takes a train in, comes back, mom and 3.2 or 2.3 children or whatever, live in their very affordable home and have a lot of nice stuff. And that stimulates the economy. And this is what we refer to as the baby boom. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance in that. But for the sake of our discussion, the churches were all over this because family, sexual ethics, morality, there's a ton within Christianity to sort of reflect upon that from whatever various stripe you are in. And so what we also see is churches getting into big building programs as they head out to the suburbs and have a really interesting dynamic, because the suburbs also brought basically the middle class into community with each other. So you had a lot of similar people of similar socioeconomic backgrounds, fairly similar worldviews, and we're expecting increasingly educated ministers that could intelligently explain the faith to them, not necessarily challenging them, because again, they could always hold to the fact that we're not rich, we're middle class. And this is the great beauty of being in that middle class, is any sort of condemnation about prosperity or wealth, you could always shift to the very rich, the obesely rich, the capitalists that Canadians have perpetually been suspicious of. And you could also do, again, going back to that loaves and the fishes, you could also do a lot of community fundraisers to send money to your brother and sister churches in the cities who were dealing with issues of poverty, crime, immigration, and sort of help out. So it became this very comfortable place to work out your faith, to work out your understandings of the world in an increasingly modern and educated nation of Canada. I don't want that to sound condemnatory. But I do want to say this really does change the dynamics of Christianity in this post-World War II period, because for now, poverty can be treated at an arm's length, and there's the ability to purchase and live with a certain amount of comfort. And the final sort of expectation that given the early sort of 20th century, how do we reflect on what happened in the early 20th century? How do we reflect on these new understandings of the Bible, especially since most of the people that lived in the suburbs would, for the most part, have at least a bachelor's degree, be fairly well educated. And again, within the schooling system of Canada into the 1960s, education and religion were still pretty close. They're separating. It's not necessarily like theology, but you would have encountered definitely some religious studies classes, the vast majority of Canadians, in their higher education. So they would expect a little bit more of an erudite pastor reflecting on these ideas with some sort of attention to the latest intellectual trends. And so this is really interesting, because at the same sort of time, we're also getting, like, the United Church of Canada in 1957 are starting to contend with some different areas, because what we're really sort of looking at here is, I think, what we would define as the nuclear family right now, the idea of like mom and dad, and like I said, however many kids. And it really did work. We had the baby boom population is, I think it's the millennials are catching up, but I think the boomers were the largest generation in human history. So incredibly influential, incredibly challenging, but also we're not necessarily going to ascribe to the ways in which they were raised, and we'll come to that in the next section. But even as early, like when we think of the 1960s, really, for any of you who sort of lived through, like really we're talking about like the later 60s, early 70s. Like the first half of the 1960s was still very much, I don't like the terms conservative and liberal. There's a lot, because it sort of ignores a lot of the undercurrents that were happening. I don't think it's a fair assessment to say like the later 1960s, early 1970s were sort of like a response to 1950s and early 1960s conservatism. I don't think that's what's going on, because like in the United Church of Canada, excuse me, in like 1957, there's an entire commission on the role of marriage and what's happening there, based largely on an increase in divorce rates, and so being like, okay, so what is the church's responsibility as it comes to divorce? And after a few years, they basically say, listen, this is between consenting adults. If they both consent to this, then it's really not. It's our business to offer supportive community, but really, if it's between two adults in the state, it's between two adults in the state, and there's no real reason for us to get involved. Of course, that's not going to be a universal decision, but it sort of shows that these conversations are beginning to happen again in the sort of marriage and family. This post-World War II period is very, very interesting. It's very complex. So we're going to see the dates down there of like 1946 to 1964. We're going to see, in the next few years, some really interesting social and policy level changes. But what we're really sort of looking at is in the realms of marriage and family, in the suburbs, in this sort of development of an educated middle-class Christianity. We're seeing something very, very successful as it pertains to numbers. We're seeing something very, very successful as it pertains to social influence. You could make the argument, and of course this is hyperbole, but it's there. You can make the argument that everybody went to church. Church was very much something that you had to do. Sunday schools were booming. We're going to come to the youth group thing in a second here. But churches were full. Of all the Protestant, the United Church of Canada was hands down the biggest. The closest Protestant church to ever come anywhere near the neighborhood of Roman Catholic numbers. Catholic Church has always been the biggest iteration of Christianity in Canada from the 1600s up to and including today. But the United Church in the 1950s and 1960s came close, and it very much was the church of the educated middle class. And so that most middle class Canadian Christians who weren't necessarily super invested in a more evangelical personal God, but just sort of had that more laissez-faire belief in God because that's what you did. United Church is definitely for you. But through all this whole stuff, more charismatic evangelical churches, Pentecostal churches, churches that had strong ties to ethnic roots, whatnot, were growing. But ideologically, most of what we now call the mainline, like the United Church, and then you have sort of Anglican and the rest of the Presbyterians, they were the sort of the big ones, as well as a variety of Baptists. And then that sort of like second tier numerically, not my personal feelings about it. You would have your groups like your Mennonites, your Pentecostals, a variety of Anabaptists, and probably your variety of Eastern Orthodox, which were like numerical, significant, but still kind of contained somewhat in regions or ignored. And that sort of brings us up to the next section. So I just sort of stop this idea of challenges to ancient interpretations of the Bible, responses within Protestantism that were divisive, and Catholicism, which is coming later. Then the post-World War II period to sort of bring together the sort of idealized version of marriage and family, which was largely an economic and marketing situation that was very, very successful for 20 to 25 years. Numerically, it bound together a society. It helped people through that post-World War II period, and actually made a very, very stable Canada. So I just wanted to stop and check in if there's any questions, comments, anything you want for clarity.
I just wanted to touch base here. This is sort of this era right here, 1946 to 1964. This is just right after the birth of, who knows what EMMC was before. There's a quiz.
Yep.
Runenweide, yes. Yeah. And so what of this ties into the history of Canada? Because sometimes we can be a conference unto ourselves, but we are part of this bigger picture. There's historians right here in the room. I'm just wondering, what are some feedback or some tidbits some nuggets you could give us from this era when the Runenweide was just being birthed in this era? Any thoughts, feedbacks, things that resonate? I'm going to pick on Dad if nobody else, because he knows a lot.
The birth was in the 30s.
Right? Yeah, in the 30s.
When it switched to English. We have that whole English.
Right.
Right.
So they're becoming less isolated and more connected to broader culture.
Becoming more. Right.
Excellent.
And moving into the city. So what he's talking about here, it's your church, case in point, Moral Gospel, right? It's in the suburbs. Yeah, very good. Any other ideas?
Well, I love this sort of conversation, but I think this is such an important point too, because I think a lot of people don't remember, and this room will probably know this, but for quite a while, and especially in the early 20th century, German was the third language of Canada. We did have English, French, and German as like the third official language. And a large part of that, I don't want to harp on this and whatnot, World War I and World War II made it very important to somewhat distance from the German roots, definitely from the German language. I mean, in World War I, of course, we have Berlin changing its name to Kitchener as an Ontario example. But this also worked for English or non-French speaking Catholics in the interwar period, is they actually got quite a bit more cultural clout because of their willingness to enroll in World War I. And also their willingness to denigrate French Catholics. And so the language, the thing with Canada, it's the deepest divide in Canada is linguistic, and it does tend to be the English-French up into this present day. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. I just wanted to raise a hand. Anybody grow up in a school where they remember they had to pay a coin if they spoke German? They could not speak German in class. You were here, you grew up here. Where did you grow up? Saskatchewan and Manitoba, southern Manitoba, right on the land we are. Anybody else not able to speak German because of the war? And you were discouraged. You were probably just after that area. It was sort of weeded out. To my generation, so my dad raised his hand. He was not allowed to after the war. And Jamie, just for some context, there's a lot of conscientious objector babies in this room. So they had babies not after the war. It was after conscientiously objecting. But my generation, we did not have a language to hold on to. So akkonem klimbeit plotich, but that's only because I want to, but not because I was taught it. And so you can already see the evangelicalism, how we become very mainstream, even though I would argue from a cultural anthropological view, which Jamie and I go back and forth on, there's still some deeply rooted things. We might not be speaking the same plotich, but we are still holding some of these same values. It always makes sense when you hear the story. So carry on, Jamie.
No, I think that's you inspired. What were you just saying? You just inspired like a really, really good point. What's like the second last sentence you just said?
I don't even know what I just said.
Oh, that's too bad. No, I think it's a very, very good point. I mean,
Our roots, we might lose the language, but it actually makes sense of our values and our deep core cultural values. It makes sense when you look back at this history.
It was the CO thing. Because again, and don't forget, for World War II, COs, they didn't have to go to war, but they couldn't stay home. So even we can make that sort of thing about World War II, is like, even if you didn't go to the front lines and we're still in Canada, like the Canadian war policy was, you don't stay home. You'll go, they'll ship you off somewhere else, and you can work, you can do a variety of different jobs. So even the sort of sense that a conscientious objector would be honored. But I mean, I'm sure there's probably people in the room there that their parents have stories of like, how do you prove that? All the different sort of interesting dynamics that brings out. So that's an interesting, that's a really good point too. Like that's kind of fascinating as well. And again, we see this with Methodism in the 1800s. We see this, it's really interesting for Canada. And this could lean into the stereotype, but as I say in the book, like, stereotypes are stereotypes because they're always rooted in a truth and a demonstrable truth. And Canada does seem to have this sort of march towards respectability, which is not part of the American landscape. As much as America influences Canada, America's celebration of innovation, entrepreneurship, and again, I'm not saying Canada's not innovative or not entrepreneurial, but America's sort of like, don't tread on me, entrepreneurship, innovation. Canada's never really quite matched that. And I think a lot of that is tied to our European UK roots, is there's a sort of sense of like, you do better here when you get into the realm of respectability. We see it with the Methodists, like they quickly, in order to grow here, and they quickly get rid of that sort of like camp revival and start focusing on like church building and becoming part of the mainstream, becoming socially responsible. And I think to a lesser extent, we'll even see that with the Pentecostals when they kind of hit their heyday in the 1980s. It goes less about being as engaging and as flamboyant. It's this weird sort of like the current of Canada is pulling us towards a little bit more like respectability, even more than success. So success is almost partially defined by, are you like, it's in many ways it's very British. It's like, are you a staid, respectable denomination that brings value to the larger social construct of this place that we call Canada. That is less the story on the American landscape. It's much more individual, but we're going to come back to the Canadian individualism. This is really good. See, these are the kind of conversations I love. I get there's people there with like the lived history. That's always fascinating. Anything else? I don't want to push through. I'm fine. I'll get done soon. All right. Well, let's go to the next one then. So 1965 to 1978. I know I just stopped for tech stuff, but I'm gonna pick up the pace a little bit to make sure, because those conversations are great. We do need to start to talk about the others, because in 1967 we have a whole bunch of social movements that are happening, but probably that year 1967, it's the centenary of Canada. I mean, Confederation is July 1st, 1867, so Canada's kind of celebrating this 100 years. So there's a lot of patriotism, there's a lot of reflecting on the past, wondering about the future. So it's a big year. It's also the year that Pierre Elliott Trudeau has his pithy comment, you know, the state has no business in the bedroom of the nations, reforming the sort of criminal code. It becomes a nation intentionally courting immigrants from a variety, believing Canada grows stronger with a multiplicity of voices. And that, of course, inspires a backlash from people who are like Canadians and don't want others in here, no matter what they're, I have conversations with friends of mine to this day. Like 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation, and they're from Serbia. They moved here in like when they were 17, and they're just like, can't stand all the immigrants. I'm like, that's you. You moved here at 17. But you get in and you quickly sort of turn your back. You're like, well, now we shut the door. We shut the door behind us. And that is very much of the 70s and 80s was this sort of, like 60s and 70s, is all sorts of ideological threats to sort of like the Christian hegemony happen. And I mean, this is the first time we do have, like, again, with the centenary, we have with a lot of immigration, we have a lot of contact both through music and popular media. We have contact with, for example, like Eastern mysticism. The Beatles brought all that sort of stuff, the use of marijuana, mind expanding hallucinogens, the idea of like tuning in, dropping out, all these sorts of things happen in the 60s and 70s. And probably most importantly is the sort of idea across the board that Christianity does not have a worldview that can adequately answer the challenges of the very modern age of the late 1960s and 1970s. And of course, now we return to the French Catholic. This is when all the problems that have been plaguing Protestantism for decades were starting to come to roost in Quebec as well. 1962 to 64, we have this amazing Vatican II, this ecumenical conference that you know, those in favor, those opposed to kind of quip. It was, you know, it made Catholicism Protestant, and that, you know, the attention of the laity, you didn't have to use Latin anymore, a whole bunch of other sort of changes. Even the idea that, you know, salvation can be found outside the Catholic Church, which is their sort of nod, be like, all right, maybe the Protestants aren't all wrong. I don't know how they feel about the Anabaptists, but they just put a big Protestant thing there. But what we really start to see is in 1966, 1967, the government of the province of Quebec basically sets up counter institutions to the Catholic Church in the realms of healthcare, education, labor unions, you name it. And so the average French Canadian no longer has to attend a church. They had to attend a church to get married, to get healthcare, education for the children, jobs, help when you don't have a job. And all of a sudden the government had all of those as well, and you didn't have to attend mass. Now, this is known as like the Quiet Revolution or the Bloodless Revolution, and it's been kind of mythologized in Canadian society. But through the 60s and the 70s, the numbers are concerning, but they're not catastrophic. But just so you get a sense of what trajectory that's set for 20th century French Catholicism, was in 1958, 87% of Quebec attended mass at least, and often more than once a week. So if we want to round, that's 9 out of 10. By 2001, that number was 20. So in 40 years, 67% or 7 out of 10 French Canadians stopped attending mass and just did what Canadians always do. We like to quip and say, we vote with our feet. They just walk away. They revolted against the Catholic Church like the French had done in the 1780s, but they did it without any blood. They just stopped attending because they didn't need to anymore to get all the social benefits of church without any of the social control. And that again is another part of the Canadian story that we can sort of talk about. But that is why I think this is the secularization story, not just of Canada, but arguably of the world, because since the 1750s, French Canadian society was built on 2 pillars, the French language and the Catholic Church. And in basically a year to a year and a half, they took out one of those pillars. And not only did the society not collapse into moral degradation and all the other things that the church always threatens, it actually did quite well. And many would say it was better. It was nice to get under the heel of the church. Now, the danger for anybody who is not Catholic is to think, yeah, that's a uniquely Catholic or French Catholic problem. But of course it isn't, because while the Quiet Revolution is very dramatic, while it's very stark, it's just like the big explosion that was absolutely happening within Protestantism. It was just happening in Protestantism a lot quieter. And just because it didn't, Protestants and English-speaking Protestants were never unified and never had the control and the numbers of the French Catholic. So for a lot, and again, we're back to the start with the safety and the security, this inclusion of the others was blamed for a lot of this collapse of Christianity. Not sort of looking at some of the other social trends, but really sort of blaming this conveniently, scapegoating on, and I mean, again, based on your region, that's sort of the people group or the ideology that challenged Christianity and brought a loss of power and a sense of a loss of control, which caused a lot of people to double down into much more conservative thinking. And I don't like that term. Probably more circling the wagons, not necessarily ideological, but definitely circling the wagons. And that will sort of lead us into the next section. But again, I want to pause, just make sure we're doing okay. We're doing okay for time as well?
Yeah, we've got 25. Any questions or thoughts on that? I have one thought. Can you hear me, Jamie?
I can, yes.
Okay. One thought is, and I don't want to go like way off track here, but parallel to all of these timelines leading up till now, and the reason I want to pause on power and control is the treaties. Right now, I'll do a pop quiz here. What treaty land are we on? Treaty 1, right. And who lived on this land? Who roamed on this land? The Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe-speaking Anishinaabe, and then later on the Métis, right? And so there's this treaty that happened in what Treaty 1 was signed, what year?
1845.
You should know this because we got off the boat a few years later. I'll give you a big hint. 1871, I think, for the Treaty 1. And what year did
of course, that's Manitoba.
What year did the Anabaptists generally settle here? There was a few waves, but so it was just a few years after the land. So I don't want to take your history lessons away, but just to put it in context, right where the land that we're on right now, Treaty 1 land, they signed the treaties, and where did the people go that were on this land? They went into reservations, right? And we came in and brought farming. We were invited as settlers to this land. So simultaneous, while the evangelical church, the Catholic church, the Protestant, the Catholics, they were duking it out. We were settled on this land as well, going through these different eras. Now, where I want to park right now, Jamie, and see what your perspective is, and maybe some perspective here, power and control is a major theme throughout those years that we didn't even know we had. So while we didn't have the political power and control, we had a lot of power and control. Why? By the color of our skin, right? And that we were invited settlers. Can you speak to what dynamic that played? Even though I'm not sure how fresh you are, I'm going to pop quiz you now on your Anabaptist history in Canada, but what power and control dynamics do you think were at play within white majority, but maybe not religious majority in the land, so to speak? And yet we have these buttons. You talk about Bible buttons, right? We're sitting on a Bible button right now. Any thoughts or comments to that?
I mean, let's dig in. This is a good conversation. This is the moments when I'm like, I wish I could be in a room. We could sort of bat this back and forth. But it genuinely, we have to divide the Canadian sort of power and control dynamic into, if we want to BC and AD it, into two sort of epochs. So 1871 is exactly it, because that's Manitoba entering into Confederation. And that's that whole backstory on that. But the other and probably more important one is the railroad. The railroad is what really does get Canada from an agrarian society into an industrial one. Now, it's going to take well into the 20th century before that's realized. And like all industrial societies, they're supported by agrarian means. But the power that is able to be solidified, the power that's able to be, and this is where I want to sort of wrestle with this a bit, is there's perceived power, especially in Canada. There's institutional power, perceived power, and actual power. And one of the fun things that Canadians tend to overlook that I think we really need to get into is this is incredibly frustrating for the ones who hold the institutional / perceived power, the leadership. For the most part, Canadians we're definitely less political. So the sort of power structure kind of boils down to how well can you assimilate into some of these ideas? But, and this is where the regionalism is such a real thing, what is considered assimilation, what is considered honoring like the national, so the policies and stuff like that, changes from region to region, because for no other reason than Canada is massive with not a lot of people. And you can fairly successfully ignore policies from on high that don't work in your day-to-day life. So what we see a lot in especially out there with the Métis, what we see out there is sadly a generations long, much more cooperative spirit. However, I would say that German, Eastern European, the reason why you're shoved to the prairie so much is one, this sort of almost true but stereotypical views like those are the farmers. But also, we don't want you anywhere near the actual centers of power, which when you're far enough away, thousands of kilometers away, the center of power is basically a term. It can frustrate you, but you can live day to day away from that. So I don't want to complicate this too much, but really it's that sort of when the railroad comes in, completed in 1885, that sort of brings import-export opportunities. That's when you really see white people jockeying with each other, and then quickly finding scapegoats to shove away. Very, very convenient that the 1870, the Indian Act, which is still in operation, made any Indigenous person a government sort of like made switching them to the reserve very, very simple. It was a matter of national policy. So that's an easy win. So there's no real motivation, there's no real incentive to challenge subtopics, no matter how amicable the relationship could have been in the past. You were given land, it's working for your family, you've got generations at this point, the treaty has been set, the treaty has been signed. 14 years later, the railroad comes in, all of a sudden there's an opportunity to make money. Everybody's sort of jockeying for position. The closer you are to the railroad, the better you're going to do. And it becomes very, very easy when the Indigenous people are, by official policy, moved farther and farther away, which coincidentally opens up more land. And white, especially when you stop speaking German, are the exact kind of people that that land surveyors and the government, both provincial and federal, are going to appreciate. Does that help at all?
Yeah. Any question? We have a question over here. You want to talk in the mic?
By the way, I was raised on Treaty 7 land, and I was born in the traditional land of the Songhees on Vancouver Island. And that whole Vancouver guy is a whole other kettle of yuck. Hello.
Hi. My question is, like, I went through high school history and all that, but I'm just trying to figure out what came first. Did they first push the Métis out of the reserves and then have all this vacant land? And then, oh, now we need farmers. Okay, so then they imported all of the Mennonites and whoever else? Or was it just kind of the other way around, that the Mennonites wanted to come and then they realized, oh, they need land. These are farmers. Yeah, and then they hoofed them out. Like, what happened? How was it?
Sorry, I missed that last part. I just got quiet.
So just what happened? The chicken or the egg?
Yeah. And
did the Mennonites push out? Yeah. Go ahead.
It's definitely pushed out. It's a very fascinating trajectory. Not a straight, like it's all over the place, but largely it is based on the fact that when it's convenient, Indigenous people are nomads and therefore have no claim on the land. When it's convenient, they're also not using the land properly, and therefore we have to motivate. So it is absolutely, there's never a question that there is very, I mean, where you're standing right now is a perfect example. So the land is sold for Confederation, and Governor-elect McDougall shows up with land surveyors a solid calendar year before the Canadian government and the Northwest Bay Company had sort of set their stuff up. It's incredibly contradictory what lands were actually sold, but the idea is Manitoba at this point, especially Red River, is sort of like the key place of how we're going to get this into Confederation for about 1871. So in 1870, land surveyors start showing up. And for those who did have allocated spaces, despite the Métis population, and I mean, this also included Scottish, Catholic Highlanders, a whole variety of people, based on that French system, which is like skinny plots that go up from the water, and the British have more like squares. And so they started coming in land surveying while people were living there. That is actually what started, that's what first brought Louis Riel to the scene, was the fact that Canadian land surveyors were coming in and chopping up the land however they saw fit and had not negotiated. So that becomes the first rejection of the Canadian government, and that would have forced the provisional government of the Assiniboine to be part of Manitoba's Confederation Act.
Yeah, a lot of the Métis, to answer the question about the Métis, a lot of them were pushed into other more remote areas, Indigenous people, First Nations people as well. And
that's across.
I have a question though. Is that why? That's across Canada? Yeah.
So like,
is that why we have land? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to point it, like, this is not specific to you. This is not a regionalism. This is across Canada, like in the Maritimes and Ontario. And usually what we see is, especially in the Catholic Church, and it worked as a missionary endeavor, and that's how it was used by the government. Is like, if you've got these nomadic people living, over 1,000 kilometers, and we're going to put them into 100 kilometers. Well, for the church, that makes it a lot easier. Because I'm like, okay, we got them in a much smaller geographical location, so we can evangelize more of them for less. And then the government said, oh, look at the church is actually really good, and some people listen to them. So the church actually started to become instrumental in not only picking the land, but also explaining to the people why they're being moved. And they never tend to look at why they're being moved. But this was across Canada, coast to coast.
That's great. One of the things I was just going to say, or a question, I had never thought of it in this way, but you brought up the land surveyors. And right now, all across Manitoba, especially in the southern Manitoba, we see squares. They're 1 mile. Is that is still remnant from the surveyed land? I know my grandfather, who passed away recently, 101 years old, has farmed this land from his parents and is it grandparents? I don't know what generation, Yishtama, but they're in squares to this day. Surveyed based on that. Now, to be clear, for those of you that are still brushing up on the Canadian history, Anabaptists weren't the colonizers. We weren't the British. We were fleeing from another land, just like we have people fleeing from Ukraine or Serbia today. We were fleeing from some land, but we were settlers. We were invited onto this land as settlers. But the thing I often say, and I'll get off my soapbox soon, but it's a very fine line. When we step off that boat as settlers, we can become colonizing. You know the difference? We're not colonizers as the ones owning this land and taking the land, but we settled here, and it's a very fine line with power and control to be colonizing in our actions by assuming the power. Go ahead.
No, and that's in it. Like the squares is a really interesting, because one of the good points, and I mean, who doesn't love a good history on law and land and geography? Like this is good stuff. This is going to wake everybody up. But it is
no
interesting.
One's glossing over.
So the reason why, and I wish I had a map for this thing, but the reason why the French system was on the skinny line is the skinny lines all came off bodies of water. So everybody, for the vast majority of people, it would go like you wouldn't have a big square, you'd have a thin thing. So you'd have like the water in your front yard, and then 6 feet back, whatever else, and then you'd have usually a church and a mill, and that was the town. And one of the major points that Riel brought up when he's trying to legally argue this sort of stuff, he's like, the British system makes no sense. He's like, because way less people have access to the water. So instead of having 30 people lined up, you now have 10. And then they sort of stack back like that. But of course, the British system, then the rents are cheaper. So the British system does not take, it's a caste system. So you'll pay 10, 20, 30. If you're paying 30, you've got nice riverside property, which of course means you can charge the people paying 20 and 10 to come across your land. And so that was one of Riel's points, is like the British system makes no sense here. It's inherently inequitable. And the French system is smaller, but more people have a share of the river for everything. So they have more. There's more water access in the Métis / French model than in the English set. So and the fact that your grandfather was on a square settlement shows that you. I think it's a good point. And again, these are conversations. It's trickier to have from my living room. But that is the point of like, yes, we have immigrants being brought in, but this goes back to my friends who came to Serbia at 17 are now in their 45 and like are just so virulently anti-immigrant. It's like, what do you like? What if it happened a few years before you? That is, I think, the universe in the grain of sand, Wendy, to what you're bringing up is once you're here, and if you assimilate, you can do well financially, or you can get middle of the road. Canada is great for getting you right into the middle of the road. But what we're becoming, and what we've known for all along, but what is now increasingly coming to the forefront is even those who were refugees themselves, the power dynamics change. That's a blessing of Canada, is you can actually make your life peaceful and well for generations. But what we're seeing now is that did come at the expense of many others. And then they were silenced, like effectively silenced from 1870 till almost 1970. Really, the first complaints are coming out in the late 60s. So first century. Yeah. No, it's a power. This is one of those great regionalisms that this is the stuff I find really, really interesting. Good conversation.
I can cover that in the next workshop too, if you.
Sure. That sounds so much fun. Not that sounded horrible, but you know, like these for me, these are the important conversations. This one's so important because we have basically it's a marketing question. And this one's one of those sort of ones where it turns on, and I think the conversations we have just having segues nicely into this, and this segues into a truly level of wealth no human generation has ever known, which was like 1980s and 1990s Western world. And really, marketing had been big since the post-Second World War. We talked about the Mad Men, the advertising agencies on Madison Avenue. But at the heart of this is what's better than having a customer for 20 years? And the marketing answer is having a customer for 40 years. It's just that simple. And this is the ad campaign. This is about building up brand loyalty. And one of the quickest and most efficient ways this was done is in about the 60s. Marketing, and I'm going through this at like a rocket pace. Marketing created the teenager. And in between time, like it had already been part of development, but it became an actual, especially since the boomers were so massive. And especially since the boomers were starting, now here's a real chicken and egg sort of dilemma as well, is did the social marketing create the rebellious nature of the teenager, or did they pick up on the rebellious natures of the teenager and then market stuff to them? And I mean, that's a great chicken and egg, because the boomers were so large and not necessarily taking on the ethics, the values, and in many cases the religion of their parents, but was a very challenging generation. This is the birth of, we've got people like Noam Chomsky, we have feminism, we have all sorts of other major social upheavals that are taking place at this time. The Vietnam War is televised, and that inspires all sorts of anti-war draft dodging, which brings denominations like the Vineyard up to places like Saskatchewan. These were California hippies that were drafting or dodging the draft, and we're starting up different Christian organizations like the Vineyard and other charismatic and Pentecostal and the Jesus Revolution people that are happening. But even more compelling was this marketing, and Christians got into like the idea of being, once again, not in the world, being in the world but not of the world. We started to really, at an interesting time, started to actually come up with stuff like Jesus rock and roll music, Jesus shirts, ways in which you could show your faith through fashion and music and all sorts of different stuff. I'm going through this so quickly, I don't even know if it's going to help. But this is important because it coincides with the celebration of the individual. Now, this has been around for a long time, arguably since the Protestant Reformation. You can really start to see the growth really of the individual. But for the first time, there's a lot of money and there's a lot of language and there's a lot of rhetoric around the individual. And a lot of it is targeted at the young. So there is an idea that in the larger culture, you're supposed to reject things. And I mean, the church starts taking some real big hits in the 70s and 80s. But we also have a lot of people, and again, with the creation of the teenager, now we start to see the growth of things like youth ministries. Now, there'd always been stuff like the YMCA, the YWCA, all these sorts of ideas, but youth ministry got a new importance in the early 70s. It was the necessary way of sort of communicating to the young, especially a generation who said, never trust anyone over 30. Well, mom and dad's pastor is going to be over 30 and therefore is incapable to speak to the young people. And as good parents, good Christian parents, you want to make sure your young people in a time of questioning remain in the church. And that's sort of at the heart of youth ministry, which is very problematic because there's so many pressures and so many desires, especially for a generation like the boomers who are questioning everything. How do you actually keep them in a church when there are so many other answers that could be provided beyond the Christian Protestant / Catholic worldview? And so what we have is, like I said, there's a marketing response. But by about the 1980s, the people who had been in youth groups were now starting to come into leadership. And these are people who had not left the church en masse like most young people in Canada did, usually right around university age in the 70s and 80s. These people had stayed. They still had some good education. A lot of them had like a Master of Divinity or some sort of Bible bachelor's degree. but they'd also been educated in this youth ministry paradigm. They'd had the guitars, they had the fun youth group activities, the Wednesday night Bible studies, the Friday night events, the Sunday night. They were special. You were unique. There was something about your Christianity that it maintained. And by about the 80s, you have people now have gone from the youth room, are now in the sanctuary. A lot of these people become youth pastors themselves and are now getting into associate and senior pastor roles, especially in the bigger churches. And this is what sort of forms the backdrop of what we commonly and sometimes tongue-in-cheek refer to as the seeker-sensitive movement, made very, very popular by people like Bill Hybels in the States. But this idea, Rick Warren is another one, this idea that these ideas could travel across the border, especially within evangelical circles, was celebrated. This is the solution to all the threats that we're starting to see as the numbers are going down and the things that we've been sort of talking about. The solve was to save the individual, and especially in evangelical circles, was this idea that if you leave the church, if you give up these if you, in the words of today, deconstruct, your very soul is at risk. And therefore, it's incumbent upon the church to very much communicate the gospel in ways that are relevant to the language and the understandings of people nowadays. There's a lot of focus on, again, we're going to return to the family and seeker sensitive. You have very pronounced curriculum and activities for children. There's a children's ministry, a youth ministry, because of course you boomers are getting older now. You're having kids, and the idea of like going to church on Sunday, it's a family event. These are very, very important, and churches that can offer that start to do very well numerically. Now the blip is going down, but in about 82, 83, it goes up. There's a few years where it goes up about 2%. So it seems like the seeker sensitive is again the solve. The unfortunate part is that it also does create a sort of rampant individualism, and it makes church shopping not only a possibility, but arguably a spiritual necessity. And this again kind of goes back to everything we've been talking about, is that Canadian Christianity as a transplanted, or in Wendy's, like as a settler faith, is very much a faith, an ideological faith. It's a faith of the heart, it's a faith of the mind. It's not necessarily a faith rooted in place. Therefore, if a church even, and this is my own childhood in Calgary, a church that was 45 minutes away from where we lived, that was completely understandable because they had a banging Sunday school program. They had stuff, they had women's group, they had all sorts of Bible studies. There was something Christian to do 5 nights a week. There's stuff for every level of childhood. And so my parents would spend 45 minutes on Sundays driving my sister and I to church, even though we probably passed easily 100 churches on the way there. But ideologically, this large church in Northern Calgary was aligning with us. It was aligning with our community. So geography had less to do with it. And interestingly enough, Dr. Terry LeBlanc sort of talks about this. This is about the time that he's a leader of Nate's Indigenous Pathways. And this is the time when he became a Christian. And it's really funny, given the fact that he comes from Indigenous roots. He said, the first thing I had to do was, he's like, I went out and bought like a 3-piece suit and wingtip shoes because I had to look like you, cut my hair, and wanted to look like a good Pentecostal. He's like, and then he got a job in youth ministry, and I'm sharing his story, so forgive me for that. But then that is what sort of led him to be like, well, we spent all this time trying to show Jesus as relevant to these teenagers by using teen culture and customs and whatnot. It's like, why am I not doing this for the culture and customs I actually grew up in? And of course, by this he means his Indigenous background. And so this really becomes it. It becomes an internal missionary push. This is the solve, and it solved the problem for a while. We went from 28% of Canadians going to a religious service once a week up to a whopping 30%. So the seeker-sensitive movement, again, was looked at as successful, but a closer look at it recognizes that the numbers went up a little bit. Baptisms did not. We started kind of getting back to that more, it's a cultural thing, it's a social thing, and some of the sort of parameters for, is this a real life-changing thing? The evidence for that is not to be found. So that the 80s is starting to respond to some of these threats in the post-World War II period, especially as the boom generation are now the parents and the leaders and are taking control. And with that, I can go to the next one.
Jamie, I'm just looking at the time here. Unfortunately, we have come to the half hour.
Okay.
Where I think we're at the top of the hour, right? Or like 2:30, we're done. Okay.
Yeah.
obviously there's a lot more that we could unpack here, but this is my segue. This is my challenge, Jamie. And then if you have any final words, you can sum it up in a sentence. Sorry to cut it off. I have one copy of his book. I'm not selling it. So that's the teaser, but it is a really good book that actually helps understand in a good narrative, some good constructive history lessons here. If you're wondering, how do we fit into all of this? I would recommend you can go to Amazon or his website. You can come take a look, just look up his name, Tyndale Overlooked, something like that. It'll show up in your search. I would suggest reading this, being a good student of how did we get here is super important. But thank you so much, Jamie. Any last words?
Yeah, I think just go to the last slide.
Okay.
And just again, what makes us strangers? The top left, the regionalisms. I think we've sort of covered that. The bottom left and the side there too is also our the impact of global ideologies and the flattening. I said the earth has gotten flattened. Our interaction with multiple different worldviews. Top right there is just even understandings within ourselves of what it is that the Bible stands for, what it is the Jesus event means, and then what I would have gotten to this last part here is how much technology has both united us, but also very, very has created a world in which we are all very, very divided, especially on the points of like fear and anxiety around family, children, health, and all those sorts of stuff. So yeah, it would all wrapped up there, but such is life. Here we go.
Can everybody look into the camera and wave or something? Just so you know that we're here, actually.
Hi.
There we go. Thank you so much.